Give people a moment to start filing in. Okay. All right. Folks are starting to file in, so I'll go ahead and start out here. Okay. I'm Kat Swatell. I am the track chair, I guess, for the society track here at NACamp. And today, our post Q&A, post lunch session here is Maps, Ethics, and Power. And I'm so excited to be joined by these amazing panelists. I'm very excited for the session. I'll just remind folks that you can use the Q&A. You can put questions in the Q&A at any old time you'd like. You don't have to wait for one of the speakers to be done. You can put Q&A in there at any time, and I'll go ahead and curate that for our panelists. The format is going to be 15 minutes talk from a panelist, and then we'll have some discussion, and then another talk, and then more discussion on and on like that. So I hope that works for everyone. Yes, so I guess we can go ahead and get started, and we're going to start off with Caitlin, or should I say Dr. Caitlin Mcdonald. We're very happy to have you here joining us. She is a digital anthropologist at DXC, at the Leading Edge Forum in DXC, working with Simon Wardley and a bunch of other amazing folks. And I am so pumped to hear your talk and get a little peek into your research. So without further ado, go for it.
Super. Thanks, Kat. Thank you so much for chairing today. You've been doing such a great job of linking all the sessions together. I've really been enjoying how much linkage there is. So hopefully we can continue some of those themes. I literally just shared my screen and now I've lost the button to do that because life is like that sometimes. Please hold, everyone. There we go. All right. Share. I'll present. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about growing digital ethics in practice. And some of you out there in the audience may have seen me present on this before, but the thing that I can add today is that both Tope and Anne are going to talk a little bit about how this actually plays out in a real world context. So I will lay out the kind of theoretical foundations, and then from there, we'll have some real world examples to play as well. And I know you've been asked to put some questions in the Q&A, but I first have a question for you. So please feel free to put this in the chat, share on Twitter, share in the chat room, wherever you like. Have a little think about this because I imagine that there might be something that keeps you awake at night. What digital ethics question keeps you awake at night? What keeps you up? What kind of pings you? What's on your mind in terms of digital ethics today? I really want to know, and please bring that up in the Q&A as well. So I'll tell you what keeps me awake at night, which is that increasingly business and policy decisions are very kind of data driven. And in fact, it's not just about business, it's about every aspect of our lives. More and more, we live in a very, what I call digitally mediated society. So you almost can't do anything without a computer or a phone or something of that nature helping you with that transaction. And as a result of that, you're kind of in these systems where you have to depend on those systems to work, to treat you fairly. And in particular, you need to be able to have some kind of mechanism for redress when something goes wrong within those automated systems. And often we don't have that. And that keeps me awake at night. But speaking of businesses, again, I think there are kind of three huge levers that really drive the way that businesses think about digital ethics. And I was actually on a different conference today. Sorry, Simon, I've been skipping back and forth. A conference called Sibos, which is actually one of the largest banking conferences in the world. And they were actually talking about this as well. And what they were saying is there are increasing pressures reputationally in a revenue way and also in a regulation way to drive forward digital ethics agendas. And in fact, this is really kind of what the three strategic drivers for any kind of business thing that you choose or do, any kind of choice that you make in business. you're going to be looking at it from one of these angles. And when I talk about reputation in particular, this isn't just about PR. It's also about how do you attract the right talent that actually wants to work with you and shares your company values and aligns with that. And also, how do you make sure consumers perceive you as a valuable choice? And in fact, you can kind of look at this, not just as a kind of hygiene factor, as in, I don't want to buy from that group, but also as if you think about something like the ethical consumer mark or fair trade mark, those are things that consumers seek out and actually want to have. So reputation in this instance can be something that really serves you as well. And for those of you who are joining and going, where's the map? I promise you something is coming. So, stay with me. These are just examples of the kinds of things that can go wrong with digital ethics. I feel like I don't need to familiarize you with them. I think we've all seen them coming up over and over and over again in the headlines. And, you certainly don't want your business having a challenge like this coming up for you in the headlines. But there are some good things it can do as well. So just one example might be that one school district during the pandemic was really struggling to get its students online. This example is from the US, but I happen to know from data from Nesta here in the UK that I believe it's 19% of Scottish people do not have sufficient data to access their day-to-day, everyday needs, to get their needs met, to use services and to do the things that they need to do, including essential like government services that they need. So that's a huge challenge. And one way that a school district dealt with that was to take all the school buses that weren't being used, put them in neighborhoods and use them to give students Wi-Fi so that they could actually access the school that they needed to access. I also want to reassure you that if you are concerned about digital ethics, first of all, you're not alone. This is a thing that's coming up over and over. And in fact, the banking conferences that I was at, really kind of high level, people who you think of as being extremely focused on just the money, they actually really think about this stuff a lot, mostly because it does impact the money. So there are a lot of tools available for you. You don't have to feel like you're starting from scratch. If you are trying to do something with digital ethics, there are plenty of kind of standards, rules-based things that you can see that the IEEE puts out. There are more speculative things that you can use, like the Data Ethics Canvas, to help you think through some of the challenges you might be facing with your organization. And finally, we come to what is not exactly a map, but it's definitely map inspired. So you, of course, I think on this call are all familiar by this point in the day with the concept of pioneers, settlers, and town planners. And I know that there are some questions about whether those are the right names for things, but stick with me. Really what I'm getting at here is you have a situation where often you have an ethical choice. If you're a small business, where you don't necessarily know what the impact of the choice that you're making is, or if you're making a new service within a business that's kind of very small or experimental, you may have no idea what the ethical impact of that is. Scale way up on the other end, you're a huge, giant megacore, and you do things all over the world, and you service products that people rely on every day. In that instance, those are usually quite heavily regulated industries, because actually the harm is usually pretty well known by the time something becomes that industrialized. So as a result, you can depend on quite rule-based regulatory frameworks to assist you in those choices. And often there's a kind of conflict in the digital ethics world that says you have to choose what's called the teleological approach, which means I'm just looking at the possible consequences of something. No, 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 that never works. Teleology is always wrong. Those people are terrible. Their morals are bad. You have to choose a rules-based approach. That's the only way that you can be assured that you're doing the right thing. And in my view, it's actually, you can appropriately size these depending on how mature something is, because if you really don't know what the consequences are, you have the choices that you have are very kind of what if based. And that doesn't mean that you don't have any ethical choices to make. And often Chris Daniel and I have had conversations about this in the past where he's like, well, pioneers don't really care about this. And I'm like, they do care about it, Chris, they do. And they also have options for how they can address those issues. It doesn't mean that you have no tools available to you. There are plenty of tools there. But also, if you are in a much more kind of industrialized state, you might find you have a much more procedural approach to how you deal with digital ethics. And I can take you through some examples there, but I'm also aware that we're only supposed to be doing 15 minutes. So behold, here is a map. You will get the slides afterwards. So if you want to take this away and use it, please feel free to do so. I think this is just a starting point, as all maps are. But in essence, it says exactly what I've just said, which is if you're in a situation where the scenario is rare, it's poorly understood, you don't really know what the consequences are, then you have some choices around how you decide to consider your ethical approaches. on the other end of the scale, you have some choices around how you consider an ethical approach in a very industrialized way. Often the challenge, I think, is the sticky middle, where you're passing between a situation where you could get away with not having a lot of regulatory or procedural-based things going on for you. And then suddenly you find that you do need those things. And if you're kind of in that threshold area, the settler place is a little bit challenging to deal with. So you can ask yourself questions like, what are the ethical challenges that we face in a kind of pure conjectural space? And you might come up with some novel approaches to that and depend a lot on futures thinking. There are some techniques of futurism that you might use around like using a futures wheel or running some design thinking programs that might really help you. If you're in the middle, then you might formalize those a little bit into kind of slightly more procedural checklists around, we always make sure that we check with these people within the business and these stakeholders outside of it. If you are a giant megacorp, then probably what you have is external regulators who are telling you what you should be doing. And one interviewee that I worked with previously was saying that what you need is a relationship of very cordial standoffishness between the regulator and the industry that is being regulated. And if there is one, some kind of external assessor or auditor, because if they're all cozy together, then you can't rely on them to be very good at checking each other's work. So you really need those relationships to be respectful, but almost adversarial. You need them to be very, very carefully checking one another's work. So you got to assume that when you are a very large business, you are going to have some external oversight that probably wasn't there when you started out. I mean, of course, to the extent that when you start out, presumably you have to operate within the legal frameworks that you know. But if there are things that you don't know because it's so novel and so rare and so new, then you can only depend on what you do know. Right, so here are some further resources which you're welcome to go and check out. And I will leave it there and open up to questions. I know we've gone through that very quickly, so I'm very happy to go back if anyone's concerned or has questions. But just please be reassured, if there's one thing you take away from my talk, it is that you are not alone. And there are many, many resources that you can use if you are concerned about digital ethics within the organization that you're working in. There are lots of places you can look for help. And I'll go back to the resources slide because I think that's probably the most useful one to do.
Okay, wonderful. All right, that was a lot of ground to cover in a very short amount of time. And I'll just say, so that everyone knows, Anne and Tapi, if you want to direct any questions to Caitlin, that's totally fine. You'll just have to unmute yourself and you can certainly direct some questions. But I'll go ahead and, Anne, do you have a question?
Oh, I do have a question, yes. So, so Caitlin, can you think of a good example of a teleological and a teleological factor going on in the moment in ethics?
I feel like you might have some in mind, so I might kick that one back to you, but I will, let me take us back to that slide so people kind of know what those things are. So I would say an example of a really clear example of something that's happening, which is on the cusp of being deontological, is the increasing regulatory attention that's being paid to Facebook and to other large tech bodies, but in particular, Facebook has been, really getting it a lot from various regulatory agencies in the U.S. Not only the FTC, but so as an antitrust, but also from other kinds of regulatory agencies. So I would say that the deontological perspective is finally coming to pass on Facebook, and how that is set to work out, we have yet to see. But the second that you're up in front of congressional hearings, I would say that's a deontological perspective that you're approaching. A teleological perspective, perhaps something like, interestingly, I feel like this one is actually a little bit more industrialized than people give it credit for, but something like the space industry, because there's a lot around, and actually, having said that, I would like to retract my answer, because if you think about it, like there's a whole bunch of stuff around people going up in space, but a lot of the issues around how do you manage spacecraft potentially banging into each other, and who owns particular bits of space, a lot of that's already been worked out because of prior non-human examples of space being used. Although I think there probably still is plenty that is teleological in that way, but perhaps something like maybe quantum computing, something that's like really on the cusp of, we're only just starting to hear about this now. Or the metaverse would be a good example. I saw an article the other day about somebody saying, hey, when an immersive experience is really immersive, then bullying is way worse than if it's just in text on somebody's screen. So that is a whole other animal, and that's not to say that you don't have some resources to think about. How do we consider, what do we do about the problem of bullying online? We do have resources around that, but there is a unique concern, which is when it's a lot more visceral than it was before, how do we address that issue? So I would say that's probably an example that's in the teleological camp.
And I will also say that that's slightly covered in book 2 of my Panopticon series.
Excellent. Thank you, Anne. Good shout out there.
All right. We do have a question about Facebook, as you're talking about Facebook. Basically, the question is calling out that Facebook, yes, they're having these congressional hearings and kind of being called to the world stage in terms of like, how do we regulate this? But still very much also in the break things space. So how does that work with this model?
Yeah, it's a great point. I'm not saying that they have yet been fully absorbed into the deontological side. I'm saying that there are some players now who are starting, that you would traditionally think of as being on that side, who are the regulators and, the kind of various external bodies that put regulation on you. They're starting to pay attention. I'm not saying that transformation has fully happened. They're not like a public utility, for example, like electricity, where the regulation is quite, or something like public safety laws or in the US OSHA concerns, like things that are very kind of heavily, you have to go through your online safety training and you're like, I'm never going to lift a box like that. It's fine. But the reality is, as people want to say, trade unions in particular, all of those safety regulations are written in blood. And there's a reason that we have them, because someone did something that really was really painful for them. So I think that Facebook is in that kind of early stage where like the eye of Sauron is turning their way and it hasn't yet fully managed to achieve its goal in terms of actually putting some codes down.
All right, very interesting. Yes, and folks can continue to put things in the Q&A if you'd like. I am very interested in this. So I'm in a master's program that's about science and technology policy. And as part of that, I've read, I don't even know how many congressional hearings at this point, like read the actual transcripts of them. And it is extremely painful, just as painful as you would imagine, I'm sure, if not more painful. But I guess what is really interesting to me is that when you get to the point of the regulators being interested, the first thing that they want to try, and I understand the reason, is to look at the existing regulations and say, how could they be applied to this thing, even when this thing is fundamentally changing the rules of the game entirely, right? So I guess as we go into this era where it does seem like things are shifting pretty rapidly, is there anything that all of us can do to like maintain that actually productive adversarial relationship with regulators, but also let them know like the rules of the game have changed and you can't use the existing regulation to try to like make this safe for consumers?
Yeah, that's such a great point, Kat. And I think it's worth saying that like all maps, you can view this in a kind of fractal way where, you don't just have to view this as saying, oh, a regulation will happen eventually, because actually what you're really describing on the industrialized side here is any kind of systematic approach. So if you're a small, imagine I start a startup and it's just me and you, Kat, and that's it, right? So we start out with an idea, we have some concerns, maybe 50 people are buying our products. That doesn't have a huge amount of infrastructure. Fast forward, we've done really well. Suddenly there are maybe 1,000 people buying our products. That has different concerns around how we store data, how we process it, the kinds of challenges we might run into when we do that. So we're suddenly like, oh, actually, we need some systems around this. And maybe there's some challenges with, let's say, our advertising data where it's only targeting particular people. And that's causing other people not to get equal access to our services. That's a problem. So you're then kind of in a deontological phase where you're starting to have some structure around it. In a larger business, you probably have a lot of internal infrastructure around this already. It doesn't necessarily have to come from the outside, but also public perception can be hugely, hugely impactful in these cases as well, because, you never want your business to be losing. I think Facebook lost something like 5% of its value the other day, that kind of thing. I mean, they got it back really quickly, so they don't care, and I keep banging on about them mostly because they really have been in the news a lot lately. But, I think that's kind of the point, is it isn't just about regulation. It's about any kind of pressure that is systematic that can then have an impact on the way that those decisions are made.
Yeah, a couple of great points there. Let me repeat them back to make sure that I got it. So number one, it is all of the pressures that the system can apply to kind of go more towards these standardized places. And then number two, we might think of this as kind of being a lot of loops. So for some specific thing, we might get to a place and then have to loop back through and loop back through and loop back through. And this is really a dynamic thing that is always happening at a bunch of different touch points. Is that fair to say? Okay.
That is fair to say. I can see a question that's come in from Jamal around how do we ensure that ethical practices are built into machine learning and AI? And again, actually, this is a really good example where that industrialization process is starting to happen. So you're starting to see, just like you would with any other code library, things that you can embed right in your machine learning flow process that at least claim to be able to ensure the fairness of your system, or various other kind of ethical principles, fairness, explainability, various things that are being asked of. They promise to do that. So I think just like anything else, you have to vet whether that is really going to work in the way that you expect it does. But realistically, you're starting to see that some of these components are getting pushed down the chain, as it were, into a more commoditized version.
Excellent. Thank you. And we have another question in the Q&A. This is the question that keeps this person up at night. Whose ethics and how might that change over time? So regulations and ethical decisions made under a regime or an administration that then change with whatever change in the regime or the administration. And they specifically bring up the example of Afghanistan.
Yeah, it's a really, really fabulous question, because, and I think this is part of what the kind of broader digital ethics movement is doing, is essentially saying for many years we've had unquestioned ethics that benefit particular groups of people at the expense of others. And how do we take a very kind of fundamental basic human rights approach to saying that at the very basic level, if we cannot achieve fairness between people that are using these systems, then these are not valuable systems. But it really is, like you say, there are a lot of contextual considerations that come into play, good and bad, when you talk about things in a more localized way. So I think that's not an answer in terms of how do I solve this problem, but it's certainly a question that I think is very much on the minds of people that are working in this industry and in this field.
Awesome, thank you. I'll say one final thing before I hand it over to Tapi, but I would really like to see the Caitlin-Chris grand debate. Maybe next year, the fireside chat at MapCamp UK is the Caitlin-Chris big debate. What do you think?
Yeah, happy to do it. Always happy to have a conversation with Chris.
All right, thank you so much. And Tapi, I'll go ahead and hand it off to you. I know you need to get in here second.
Hello, everyone. Can everybody hear me and see me?
Yep.
Fantastic. And good morning, good afternoon. Actually, sorry, I said good morning. I realized that it's actually good afternoon. This is like a UK-based conference. Well, you can hear that I'm English. I actually live in Chicago. And I'm really excited to be here. I've been working with, I'll say I've been like the avid apprentice of Simon's for a good few years now. And I really, really enjoy anything to do with maps, because it's a very different way of thinking about business and business strategy. It's not typically how organizations think. And for those of you who aren't familiar with who I am, I work for a company called the Kraft Heinz Company. So that's like mac and cheese for those in America, Heinz beans, ketchup, mayonnaise, all those delicious food products. And I'm the global head of employee digital experience. And I actually really love this conversation around data, ethics, and power, because Caitlin, I love how you explained your examples were looking at an organization like versus the world, but really what does it look like when you talk about data within an organization? You know, your question on like what keeps you up at night, for me, the thing that keeps me up at night when it comes to like ethics and particularly data is how do we move away from viewing employee data as something scary, and how do we actually embrace the access to data and enable people to have more like I'd say like control and autonomy over their lives, whether that's in work or in their personal lives. Like that's what I think data can do. I sincerely believe like data plus human, you will create like, so I call it like a Terminator, but some form of like bionic being. And I think that's the thing that keeps me up at night. Just how do we move away from that? When you mentioned like the bank especially, I think data is less about how the customer perceives. Actually, within Kraft Heinz, we have 40,000 employees, and my customers are my employees. And in the same way, you kind of service a customer or a consumer, and the consumer may ask, like, do I want to buy this product? Well, actually, employees can ask the same question. You know, do I want to work for this organization? Do I want to be here? And you know, there's this big conversation around the Great Resignation nation, or I don't know, I think it's something, it's called something like the Great Resignation. And actually there's a lot of research that says 40% of employees want to leave their company within the next 3 to 6 months, with this idea that the grass is greener. But really, I think it's even more than that. I think it's employees are beginning to say, you know, I really love like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There was this need for like psychological safety. And actually, once we progress through those through those levels of the hierarchy, we move on to people being mindful of this idea of like self-actualization. What is my purpose? Is this organization aligned to my purpose? Am I in my flow? And does the values of this organization align to like my individual goals? One of the things we look at within Kraft Heinz is, there was previously a talk about work-life balance, which doesn't really make so much sense these days with everybody being so accessible 24/7. And what does life balance look like? And then when we think about life balance, like what does that harmony of the individual's life, how does that harmoniously play into how they work? Now, the reason I'm mentioning all of these is because actually like data and the access to data and your attitude towards data and your attitude towards like power and hierarchy and ethics play into all of this. I mean, if we talk about life balance and we say there's the holistic being, the holistic employee, the holistic individual, well, actually, then we're saying that, you know, there's no differentiation between work and life. So actually then how do we empower the employee to be effective and mindful of how they spend their time and how they think about work and they think about their personal lives? And how do we make sure that there's that nice symbiotic relationship between the organization and the individual? So then what does data look like in an organization? It comes from like a number of different places. I think it's not just about like how employees work. There's this conversation around like productivity and efficiency, but really like what is productivity and what does it mean to be efficient? You know, we can look at Microsoft tools and we can say people are logged in between these amount of hours, but actually does that mean that the employee is productive? And actually, do we assess productivity as the outcome of a tangible outcome, or is it the ability to enable people to be able to like fail and feel safe in failing? Caitlin, you also mentioned about the tensions between authorities, where it has to be respectful, but also like adversarial, and it should be respectfully so. When I think about a company like Kraft Heinz, which is where I am, we actually have our own internal ethics and data council, and I can say for sure that the relationship is like that. Kat, I really loved how you said, don't look at how you did things in the past and expect to apply those methodologies to things in the future. Almost like, you know, all keys can't open new doors. And actually just helping educate and helping understand like what is the purpose and what is the need for different types of data. Maybe I'm talking quite vague, but I'll talk about one thing specifically. If we talk about this idea of this holistic being and life balance, one of the things we're really focused on is how do we empower our employees to have data about how they work, almost like a Fitbit for their lives? How do we enable people to know how often they reply to email, just the visibility of how you spend your time. Imagine if I was a marathon runner, I might run quick, but actually I probably should care about like how I eat, how many calories I eat, like how does glucose look like in my body over a certain period of time? What's my speed over a certain period of time? Are there better times and days for me to run faster? Are there times and days where I should be resting? And that's what I believe is this new empowerment of data for employees. And I think like that concept, at least at an organization in like similar to the one that I'm in, is quite pioneering. It's actually very new. It's not something that we ever really thought about. And actually, when we look at how that relationship works, like with our Ethics and Data Council, it again is very, very new. The Ethics and Data Council is built up with people in HR, people in legal, and people in our security team who are advocates for the employees and want to make sure that they protect like Kraft Heinz, and they protect the employees. So in this particular use case of this like Fitbit for your life, which is it's actually not a solution by Fitbit, but I'm being conscious that I don't want to like promote certain technologies. So it's easier for me to describe it as a Fitbit for your life. The way we can kind of work together in that harmonious way, allowing the council to kind of challenge us and push us in the right way, is that we start with like a proof of concept where we have like a very small group, around about 100 employees out of the 40,000 we have, where we give them access to this solution. We kind of let them go free rein, see if they can intuitively use it. And then we bring them back in. We'll do some education on like how you can use the solution. We'll do some qualitative and quantitative feedback. Then we present it back to the Ethics Council. Then we do a pilot with a bigger population. Then we'll look at like a different zone or different geographies or functions. And then we look to commercialization. And I think that, at least in my experience, is something that I'm recognizing to be quite new. This idea of like proof of concept, pilot, and commercialization. And actually, I'm describing that in Kraft Heinz, but I think that's kind of relevant irrespective of internal, external, or size of organizations. And I think that's because we've also noticed that there's been like a democratization of power and a democratization of data, and predominantly driven out of this move towards hybrid. You know, how people were able to kind of control groups and have access to information was maybe sometimes based on their physical presence or their power over resources or the power over knowledge or their positional power with an organization, which we could see exemplified in like the physical environment. And now that everybody has moved virtual, it's kind of fully democratized both power and data. And now we're trying to rebuild and understand what that looks like. So I have been talking for some time. I wonder if there are any questions or if anyone wants to ask me anything, or I can just keep going.
We do have a question. If you have more to say, we certainly have the time for that, but we do have a question if you'd like me to read that. Should I go ahead?
Sorry, my thing crashed, Kat. So I heard you say if we do have a question, I can take the question now.
Okay, cool. Yes, so Manish is wondering about how ethical choices change as things evolve. So you can read more in the Q&A there if you can see that. But there are things that are fast-tracked, right? Like the vaccination trials. We've had a case where we needed to fast-track that, and a lot of attention on that, regulatory attention. But how does the ethical perception of certain things change depending on like where it is in the timeline of evolution?
That's a fair question. So this tool that I'm talking about, which is like the Fitbit for the employee's life, actually, we've been trying to launch this for maybe about 2.5 years to no success. And we recognize now that, hey, okay, people are at home, people are feeling fatigued, people have gone through the change to being remote, and actually now it's becoming more established, and actually now people should really have access. If you have access with a Fitbit in your personal life, you know, you can say, how long does this meal take to cook? You can see the ingredients in your food. You can see how those ingredients impact your body. You can assess so many other things in your life, and why wouldn't you do that in work? And actually the business case, the use cases kind of remain the same, but sometimes you need that urgency that comes from like an external party. And I don't actually genuinely believe that that's the wrong thing. Sometimes it's not now, it's just, sometimes it's not no, like never. Sometimes it's not just no to not now, if you get what I mean. And I think that's, you know, there's like the idea of like importance and impact, and actually something has to be both impactful and importance for it to be relevant now. And I have no issue with like urgency coming from external sources.
Yeah, that's something that I feel is becoming a thread across your talk and Caitlin's talk, like the idea of a window, right? Where things like come to the public attention or, you know, start to gain some momentum as far as being regulated. But there is the idea, I think, of a window where like you're talking about this, where you want to provide employees with this data that can help them actually have a better life, a more like healthful life as an employee. I don't know what the right term would be for that. But the idea was there, but now with this big shift, like this is the window for it to happen.
Yeah, even as Caitlin mentioned, you know, like these whistleblowers with Facebook, they've known these things for years, but sometimes it's the time. The time has to just be right. It's like anything, right? Timing plays a big point and a big factor in life in general. Caitlin, I saw you came off mute though. Were you going to add a point?
Yeah, I was going to also jump in on Manisha's question, and I think there's a couple examples I can relate to that to as well. So one of the people I advise is a chief bioethics officer at a large pharmaceutical company. And he was having a challenge where, you know, this is a really great example of obviously bioethics, very, very heavily regulated, pharmaceuticals, heavily regulated. You know, as Manish says, yes, there were fast track vaccine trials, but those were all really built on very, very existing protocols for things that had already been tested. So it's not like they were really fast tracked. It was just on top of things that had already been done, like those had already been very, very heavily vetted. So this person was asking me, you know, he was saying, I really have a challenge where we have these new essentially marketing people who are coming in, and they would like to use patient data in ways that are much more about, partly about proactive wellness, but also partly about targeting them for particular products. And he was like, you know, obviously on the scientific side, we have real concerns about the kind of harm that could do, and we're very cautious about it. And because the data that those groups of people who had typically previously not been working in roles that were bioethics related, they'd been working in advertising companies, or they'd been working in selling online products or things that are less potentially harmful, let's say. Their approach to the data was very different because they didn't really understand the potential harm of the kinds of data that they were using now. And so I think there's an element here around not just the scale of the data that you're using, but the potential harm of the type of data that you're using and the potential impact that has on someone. And so if you think about the kind of data that Tape is describing, you know, I mean, first of all, let's be honest, not every company wants to use that data in a nice way, which is what Tape is describing. And I trust her completely to do things that are in the employee interest because I know her. There are plenty of other companies that want to use the same kind of data in ways that are not geared towards the employee experience, but that are perhaps geared towards a more control-based approach rather than an empowerment-based approach. So I think there is something around, there's something for me around the types of data that you are using and the kinds of impact that can have on people's lives, the scale of the kind of impact that can have both on an individual, but also massively, and also the intentions of the people who are capturing that data and processing it. You know, is it for the benefit of the person that you are capturing the data about, or is it for potential adversarial relationship with that person? And those questions, I think, as you're thinking about these things and the kinds of systems that you're building, those are the kinds of questions that I would be asking myself if I was having some concerns about a system that I was using or building.
I think that's a fair point. And actually, I would say, I think everything's, well, I'd like to think that everything starts with the best of intentions. And actually, those are sincere questions, conversations that we have with our ethics and data council. They know why we want to use it, but we also need to be able to assure people why and what it will be used for, which is why we developed this proof of concept with a small population, pilot, commercialization. And I think that allows you to kind of like iterate quite rapidly. I really like this idea of like sprints and agility, because sometimes you can have, what is it called? You can become stagnant because you have so many different choices and are almost like so fearful of so many questions that you don't have an answer to, that it prevents you from moving forward. But actually, when we talk about the pilot, and I should really talk about the population we use, people actively self-nominated to join the pilot. These are like what we call like digital enthusiasts. But really, if you guys are familiar with like Jeffrey Moore's innovation adoption curve, you know, you have your enthusiasts, you have your early and late majority, and then you have your laggards. When it comes to testing new things, it's probably better to use that enthusiastic group, those who are happy to try things in beta phase, those who are happy to give you active feedback, and those who are happy to enable you to learn and grow. And Caitlin, without knowing the complexities of this scenario you just mentioned, my initial response, based on my now just like years of being on the receiving end of hearing like, no, you need to do this, no, you need to do that, I've always found confidence in this small pilot, this small proof of concept group, no more than like 100 people. I mean, based on a population size. So a manageable group that your team can have that like intimate relationship with, who can help you learn and who can give you that direct insight and who can really help you build a business case. Sometimes we just intuitively feel like, I'm saying Fitbit for your life, but maybe the reality is at the end of all of this testing that it just doesn't work in the business environment. And it might not be that it will never work. It might just be that it doesn't work today. But you kind of need to go hand in hand with willing participants and then slowly tweak and tweak and tweak and tweak, because when it comes to something like data, it is very sensitive. And you know, a friend of mine is an engineer, and she said to me, Toppy, you know, I love it. Actually said, I really like it when a consumer will use something I've designed in the way I intended them to, but I love it when they use it in a way that I didn't even think of. And that reminds me a lot of like the projects that we run and the tests or the experiments that we run. Sometimes it's great when people use it in the way we intended, but it can be scary, especially when it comes to data, if somebody uses it in a way that we totally did not imagine whatsoever. And I say scary just because it's kind of like unknown. So again, I think that proof of concept, pilot, commercialization, it's almost like a funnel, starting small and going big, and it helps you define your objective. Sometimes you start with a problem, and actually how you think you're going to resolve that problem is very different than how you actually go about doing that, in my experience. And actually, transparently, with something like data, I don't ever know if we will ever get to a stage where it becomes so like commoditized, and it's just, I don't know if data will ever become something so rigid and structured in that way. I think it may just be something that we are continually iterating with, because actually now we have access to so much more data than we can probably consume, than we actually know what to do with. And I think, Caitlin, maybe we spoke about the idea of like principles versus rules, like principles as an approach to data as opposed to like strict rules. And maybe that gives us the flexibility and fluidity. But sorry, Kat, you're going to say something.
No, I just think those are excellent points, and we're getting tons of questions in the chat, kind of building on these points. One of the questions that I was wondering about as well, how do you ensure data security and I guess be transparent with folks about internal usage of the data and external usage of the data? Like, I personally have been in situations where McKinsey comes in and collects a bunch of data about it, and I feel like I don't have a say in that, but I don't want a company like McKinsey profiting off of me.
I hear you. Like, I think that's fair. I think, for example, we are all in a Zoom call now. Maybe Zoom would kind of anonymize the data, but really they probably are able to pull some statistics where they say these types of people join these calls with these other types of people over this period in time, and they'll probably be able to kind of take some sentiment out of the fact that we're using their tool. It's just, even like if this was Microsoft Teams, Microsoft would also be able to do the same. That's how they're able to pull up like all of these statistics, so they can see how populations come together. And I think we just have to get a little bit comfortable with that if we want to use the tool. And this is like on a macro level, then I'm going to go smaller into at least what gives me comfort. I mean, I joined Zoom, and I joined Zoom to speak at conferences. I joined Zoom to actually work out. I joined Zoom to have calls with my family because I'm in Chicago, they're in the UK. I joined Zoom for a multitude of different like cases that I'm trying to solve in my own personal life. And I recognize that with access to like technology and this like democratized technology, right, where I can pretty much meet anybody anywhere in the world at any time, as long as I'm willing to be awake at that time. I also recognize that there's like the risk, and there's also there's a reward, but there's also kind of like the risk of that. And I think maybe there's something about like education and feeling comfortable with that. Because sometimes you can have this idea of like mock bureaucracy, I feel it is a way that it actually isn't. And I think we need to be like, the bit that at least I think about for my own personal life is I need to be comfortable and fully have my eyes open in terms of what that means. When it comes to using it in a business context, so those are exactly the same questions that the Ethics and Data Council ask us. They say, will this data leave the company, or will we join something external where we can't bring the data into the company, or we can't protect it, or will it leave the company? And actually right now, the most comfortable place is that nothing should really like leave the company that has anything to do with employees. And I think that's like fair and relevant. I hope that answers the question. I guess my response is it depends, but I think there's a big part of education. And I think education through transparency. Right now, we don't really actually know who uses. I mean, if I go to the doctors and I get a vaccination, where do they take that information? Where do my medical records go? I don't know, if I go to Starbucks and I pay on my Starbucks app, like what data does Starbucks get from me using the app? So there's probably like a degree of comfort that we need to have just as we evolve in general, but there's also like another degree of like transparency. And back to Caitlin's earlier point, I think things like Facebook, by choice or by force, we will begin to get that transparency.
Yeah, I would love to see a world where employers, especially large employers who are collecting data about their employees, that they were using their position as employers to educate employees about how data is collected and at which touch points and what that data is used for, and create more literacy around that. But a girl can dream, right? Yes, another question that kind of builds on that is how do employees opt in or opt out of data collection in the workplace?
Very good point. And actually, we have an opt-in model. I mean, so right now with this proof of concept, people opt in, but the idea is when we commercialize, it will be very much opt-in, and it will be very clear. We will do a huge campaign in terms of what this will be used for and what this will not be used for. If anything changes how we communicate that, we are taking this incredibly seriously. It's not, I mean, I'm saying it's not a joke. From my experience, it is really, really very serious. And I think it's important for people to be able to opt in. You should have the choice, right? I mean, so my background is in behavioral science. I like the idea of things being automatic. I like the idea of things being like mainly opt out. So, because you have, for example, it becomes like your pension or like organ donations. If people are able to opt out, then you tend to have better, like consumption of whatever the thing you're trying to do is. But in this case, especially when it's very new, it's very different, it can feel a little bit scary. It's certainly going to be an opt-in. And to ask the question around how employees opt in, even the process to opt in is not just, it's not almost like, when you sign up to a newsletter and they say, oh, untick this or tick this if you want to get more. It's not something hidden within that. It's a very intentional opt-in process, going through a very intentional process, which really makes it very clear. It's not even going to be an automatic habit thing. You have to be very, very intentional, and it's very clear how you will opt into that.
Yeah, I love that, making it highly conspicuous, at least to start. Yeah, wonderful. Okay, I think we're going to get into more discussions of power, but there is a question right now in the chat about power and about the statement that you made, Tapi, about the democratization of power in some regards as we transition to a remote setting. What types of power or sources of power were you referring to?
Sure thing. Maybe more so like positional power. So I really like there are like 4 dimensions of power. I think it's Luke. I think it's Stephen Luke who talks about the 4 dimensions of power. He talks about like positional power. He talks about resource power. He talks about like expert power. And then he talks about like reverend power. Now, I think actually the 2 main types of power that I've seen haven't gone, but they've just changed in terms of how we think about them, is first of all, positional power. Because actually we are all in Zoom. If you put everyone in gallery view, everyone's grid is the same. Everyone's voice is like the same volume. It's kind of awkward if someone starts talking over somebody. Can you tell how tall I am? I could be 5'2". I could be like 6'2". You can't really tell. And those types of things that people were able to physically show, even like symbols of power status, power symbols, right? So like a car, jewelry, clothing, those kind of subtle cues to power that we just knew, and they were just there, and we just kind of like subconsciously consumed, they've changed. And I actually think that's quite interesting, because maybe people who would use their positional power, or their positional like physical power in the older, in a more physical environment, it doesn't really work in this type of environment. And actually within that, I think it's, first of all, there's been a leveling of the playing field, but as it's began to mature, I've also noticed that it's kind of shifted. Some people have been able to switch and evolve, and others haven't. So for example, it's very clear, like if we look at everybody's background here, I'm in an office, does everybody have like an office? Does everybody have like, how you've got your whiteboard behind you? Like the new statements of power have certainly changed, and like how you present yourself to the world and how you're perceived by the world have certainly changed. And then even when I think about like expert power, and if I double click into expert power, what I mean about that is, how do you communicate in a virtual environment? How do you kind of influence in a virtual environment? It's no longer that I can tell someone, let's go for dinner, let's go for a drink, do you want to go for a coffee? Well, no, it's changed. And actually, again, then when I think of that type of power, that has definitely even democratized too. We can even look at resource power. Maybe a silly example, maybe there was someone in your office, actually I say a silly example, but it was certainly one in Craft Times that's real, when it came to like monitors or access to like technology, like new technologies, or even like memorabilia, like things people would wear, like branded memorabilia in the physical environment. If someone had access to those types of resources, they had a certain level of power. Well, that doesn't really mean anything in these days. Like, what does that new power symbol look like? Is it that you have access to new technologies that make your virtual experience enhanced versus maybe like your peers or anybody else? And those are, I guess, to answer the question, those are the different shifts in power that I'm talking about. First of all, I feel like it was the leveling of a playing field, and then actually the rebuilding of new expressions of power.
Yeah. There's been so many interesting things about working exclusively remotely, but a few months ago was talking with fancy executive person or whatever, and I think of those people as being like, yeah, let's get back in the office so that I can be in my corner office and show how much space I take up and those kinds of things. And he said, I just want to stay like this forever because I'm super short and no one knows it now.
Exactly. It's true, isn't it? It's true.
Okay. Yeah, it was just very funny. Like it just never even occurred to me, but yeah, so many really interesting things. And I know there are more.
I can jump in with another example around that, actually, Kat, as well. So I also did a huge chunk of research around the shifting ways that our working environments are changing as a result of being more distributed. That has a little bit of an ethics component, but it wasn't really fully about that, but it is really a lot about power. And one of the interviewees that we had for that said, it's really different having town halls now. They used to all be in the auditorium. They were really far away. They were in the dark. I couldn't see them. They'd have to really be brave to lift their hand and ask a question. And now they're all right here in my face, and they are not shy about asking me questions about things that are going on. So for them, it really was a democratization, but I also think it's worth acknowledging that it hasn't been an equal playing field for everyone. And as Tape has said, it's shifted a lot of things. And for some people, that's gotten a lot worse. So there's definitely been a change that we have to acknowledge, for sure.
This whole subject interests me a lot, I have to say. I used to work in opt-in surveillance technology. That was an area that I was in for years and years. And you learn a lot about what people what people care about. It's really when you cannot predict what people will want you to record and not want you to record. It's entirely about what the payoff is for them. So I have people who would quite happily send me reams of their porn history if they really wanted me to fix a problem with their thing so that they could do their timesheets, because actually they really cared about something that automatically sorted their timesheets out for them. They didn't really care if I saw their porn history. So it's very specific. But I mean, myself, I love being observed. I totally love being observed. And a big part of that is, well, I have multiple sclerosis. So I'm ill quite a lot, and I need to have information that will help me be better in future. And it's amazing how Google and Amazon went through a period where they would say, oh, you know, have you thought about reading this book? Because people with your buying history seem to really like reading this book. And it's been incredibly useful for me to have that. They've actually stopped doing it because I think they got in trouble for intrusiveness in you know, because it was quite obvious from the book that they'd been able to deduce an awful lot about my personal situation. But it was really useful stuff, and I really regretted that they stopped doing it. I think you cannot judge for other people what information they are willing to give away, because you don't know what they care about. So yes, you have to be careful not to assume that other people have the same values that you do. Everyone's quite different.
Such a great point. Thank you so much. And I know we have other questions in the chat, but I do want to get to Anne's talk. And Manish has been a superstar asking so many good questions all day. So I will get to those questions, Manish. But Anne, I will go ahead and hand it over to you, if that's okay.
It is, right. Well, I will attempt to hopefully share my application. There we go. Right. There we go. Excellent. Right. Can you see that all right? I'm going to assume that's excellent. Good. Right. So I feel a little bit bad about my talk because it's not quite as much, quite as aligned as the two previous as Toppy and Caitlin's talks, but hopefully it'll be interesting. So I've been in the tech industry for nearly 30 years now, and I've been involved in lots of interesting things, such as operating surveillance software. But at the moment, I'm interested in green software and changing people's behavior in the industry, in the tech industry, to be more aware of climate and how that might change their behavior. So my interest at the moment is about how you change behavior, how society can adapt to a really very radical change, how the society in the tech industry, and therefore there's other things that we can learn from that about society more generally. And I don't really like to talk about climate and ethics in the same track, because it kind of implies that being green and climate is about ethics, and it's not. It's just risk management. This is a pure safety of society issue. It's not really an ethical issue anymore. But I have to communicate it quite a lot, and I have to talk about it and try and persuade people. So power and ethics, they all do, and dynamics do all play into this messaging. And I recently got involved with something called the Green Software Foundation, and I was sucked into this foundation because they presented their vision with a diagram. And I do love a diagram. So I've worked from home for years and years, a long time before the pandemic. And I really like working from home. But there is something that I miss about working from home, and that is a whiteboard. I do love being in an office, drawing things on a whiteboard, and diagrams are absolutely fantastic for that. And this is a pretty good diagram that outlines all the things that we want people to do. We want it to be green, we want it to be carbon efficient, and that means being energy efficient and hardware efficient and aware of how much carbon you're using depending on the time of day and all that kind of stuff. So this is quite a nice diagram. But I'm very aware it's not a map. Now, I'm not, as I said, I'm not an expert in mapping, but I wanted to try and learn a little bit about how I might communicate this message in a more contextually aware way than just saying it's inefficient, energy efficient, and hardware efficient, carbon aware. Just go away and sort it out. You know, what are people gonna be convinced by? What are people going to be resistant to? What's easy for them to do? What's difficult for them to do? So I really wanted to try and get and see this not just as a diagram, but as a map. So I kind of did my first ever map, which I was trying to put down all the things that I thought in the tech industry. This shouldn't, although this is in the tech industry, it's pretty general user stuff. You know, machine learning and user devices and the cloud and what's already carbon efficient software, high performance software, which I used to work in before I worked in surveillance software. I used to work in high performance software. And high performance software and carbon efficient software are very similar. You kind of want to be efficient in how you're using electricity by doing less stuff. And actually, if you want to be high performance, you want to run more quickly, you want to do less stuff. So by chance, they happen to be very similar. So
sorry, really quickly, we are not seeing a map. We're just seeing a blank slide.
Oh, right. Okay. Oh, no. So I can see well, let me go back. Can you see the diagram again?
Yes. Green software, carbon efficient.
Okay, cool. I'll try moving on to the slide again.
Yes, there it is.
The map. Right. Excellent. Right. So I've told you a little bit. Actually, maybe it's not so bad because I've told you about the kind of things that are on the map, and then I can show you the map. And you can see that it's quite interesting because there's a lot of stuff over to the right in the kind of commoditized and becoming more commoditized areas, which is the cloud, which is something that Simon talks about a lot because as being very commoditized. And then you've got a load of stuff on the left, which is actually where traditionally all the green software, the carbon efficient software used to lie. Things like high performance software, which tends to be very custom built. Now, the scary thing about this map, as soon as I wrote it, it became quite obvious. The scary thing about this map is that all the things we need, like high performance software and all the techniques and software efficiency tools, are on the left, and that's not mostly because they've only just appeared and nobody's been thinking about them. They've been on the left over here for my entire career. I mean, it was the 90s when I worked on high performance software, and it was in exactly the same position of this map then as it is now. It's not moving right at all. So when I want to go and tell people to write green software and to think about software efficiency, I'm telling them to do something which is resolutely custom built. So it's likely to be they're really likely to be quite resistant to that because it's going to be difficult. Writing high performance software has traditionally always been very difficult. It's been tricky skills not many people have, that kind of thing. And things haven't changed. I mean, there's a few stuff coming up where people are a bit more aware of it, like you don't want apps that drain your user device, but that isn't really about choosing apps that are incredibly efficient. That's about not choosing apps that are terrible and instantly drain your device. So it's kind of, there's a slight awareness there, but it's not really good enough. It's just kind of the bare minimum. So I was a little bit worried about this, but I thought I would draw in some lines between things so that I could get a feel for how all this stuff might fit together. And this is a very simple. I did the usual thing of doing an enormously complicated map with thousands of things on it. Then I realized that wasn't really helping me to visualize the things, so I took out some stuff that I thought was somewhat extraneous.
And You might need to go back a slide and go forward or something like that again. That's not.
Okay, right. I'll go back.
Okay.
I'll go forward. That's Chromebooks for you. They don't really play very well with this. Excellent. Good. Yes. So I put a line in here. I have to say I have not used maps very much, but I did find this really very useful. It really made me think about the problem in quite a different way and see linkages that I wouldn't otherwise have seen. So I'm now quite sold on mapping as a result of doing this. That when I started to link things up, it was kind of as I was kind of imagining it in my head. Most of the stuff about carbon efficient software, all the things that related to it were on the left-hand side of the chart. High performance software, software efficiency tools, use devices and device power management. But then I realized there is one, and that's all in the stuff that's not very easy for people to use, not a very easy sell. But there is one thing that links carbon efficient software to the kind of things that are going on in the cloud that are very popular at the moment. So spot instances, if you're not in the tech industry, you probably won't be so aware of them, but the cloud is actually really quite carbon efficient. It's quite good because because they care about that, because it's part of their cost of goods, is how much electricity they use and how many machines they use and how many machines they throw away when they didn't really need to, all that kind of stuff. It's important to them, so they care. But mostly users don't care, and that kind of stuff isn't really exposed to users who are using cloud products. But and most users who use cloud products use something called on-demand instances. So it's not, you don't use machines in the cloud, you use something called virtual machines. And most people use these virtual machines that all the time. They say, I'll have a virtual machine and I'll just use it all the time. And that's the vast majority of use. But there's another kind of virtual machine called a spot virtual machine. And the spot virtual machines offer jobs that are and the cloud providers like them because they can be moved around, they can be shifted around, they don't have to run at any particular time, they're quite flexible. Cloud providers can use them to, when they've got a bit of spare space, a bit of slack in the system, they go, well, stick a spot instance in there and make a little bit of money running the spot instance, and then when it's finished, I'll take it out and use it for these on-demand instances again. It helps the cloud providers to increase something called their server utilization. So it means that they use their machines more efficiently within their cloud, which helps them to cut the cost of operating the cloud or improve the revenues. It's kind of like selling your kind of your offcuts or something. It's something that they didn't really plan. It's where they've got extra spare capacity they weren't using for anything else. They'll sell to you as a spot instance. But because spot instances can be moved around and they increase efficiency, they're actually really good for for writing green software. And they are basically one of the few things that link carbon efficient.
I think we're having a little bit of trouble with the audio. Anne, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Sorry, it just cut out for a few seconds.
Ah, right. That was because I switched slides, which obviously it doesn't like. Can you see my new slide?
It's just blank.
Oh, all right, okay, just a minute. I'm going to switch back and forth again.
Okay. Yep, there it is. Evolution.
Excellent. So this is where I get to introduce to this map, because the old map of what's going on is kind of static. The things on the left aren't really moving. The things on the right are moving slowly. The cloud is moving slowly, even further rightwards, but it's not a massively changing situation. But actually, in climate, we have actually got a really quite, especially in tech, a really quite fluid situation at the moment, because there are two. There are teleological and deontological factors coming in very quickly to change what's going on in our industry, and how we as people within our industry will have to behave. But they're just kind of hinting at how society in general is going to be affected by climate change, and how we're going to have to behave, or how we're going to have to change our behavior. On the teleological side, we've got something called zero carbon. We've got this.
Anne didn't change slides, but she cut out for me. Not sure if she cut out for anyone else.
Oh, Mike, can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. So well, I'll quickly rejigger what I just said, but the situation is changing. We've got new teleological and deontological factors coming in, changing the landscape here, changing our map landscape. Teleological, in 2020, all of the three big cloud providers, who are the biggest companies in the world, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, announced something really radical, which very few people have picked up on, but it's going to completely change our lives over the next decade, which is that they committed that they would run all the cloud, which is basically by 2030, it will be all of software, all of the tech industry, carbon zero by 2030. And that's an unbelievably difficult goal. It's not some airy-fairy carbon neutral goal. It's genuinely producing no carbon as a result of running their operations, which sounds like it would be plausible. They could run everything off wind and solar and all that kind of stuff, but actually it's considerably tougher than that, and it will require quite a lot of change to the way that we use applications. So, because hand in hand, that's teleological. They didn't have to do it. They're doing, although you might say they were just imagining a future in which it will be legally required for them, which I think they'll be sensible to imagine that it's certainly coming, but it's not legally required for them now. So they're being a little bit visionary there. They're saying this is the right thing to do, and we'll do it. But we've also got some things that are clearly deontological, that are very, very close to now, that are coming very, very soon. And that is the move away from high availability power to variable power. So it's almost a cliche that power is in the bottom right-hand side of all Wardley maps. But I'm going to say that power is about to split into two halves. High availability power, which is what we used to get all the time from fossil fuels, to variably available power, which is solar power and wind. So we get solar when it's sunny, and we get wind when it's windy. And if it's not, we don't get that much power. And suddenly power goes up in price quite considerably. And that's going to affect the cloud a lot, and everybody who runs tech products. In fact, it's going to affect every industry very significantly. That suddenly power will be cheaper sometimes of the day and more expensive at other times of the day. If we start to add the lines for these new variable pricing, variable power into our map, they all converge on these spot instances that the cloud providers invented for a completely different reason, to just save themselves money and get better utilization on their machines. But they fit in very well with this idea that sometimes you want to run stuff and sometimes you don't want to run stuff. That some things are urgent and some things are important, but urgency and importance are not identical. And when I started to look at this, and I started to look at this map, urgency and importance are not identical, it absolutely cast me back in mind. So I've just switched slides. Did that work?
Looks good.
Okay, cool. It switched me back because I'm quite old compared to although I'm going to guess that a lot of people in map camper and and most of those videos appear to be about the key to being an organized manager is that you knew the difference between urgency and importance. That everything that is important is not necessarily urgent, and everything that's urgent is not necessarily important. And over the past 20 years, that's kind of changed. We've kind of moved to a way of managing where we just manage everything as if it's urgent, and that has been quite effective for us. But it was terribly reliant on power being high availability and cheap. And the next 10 years, particularly, maybe in 20 years' time, we're going to have really good batteries and we won't have to worry about this anymore. But for the next decade, I think we're going through a period where that's not going to be the case. We aren't going to have power on demand, and we are going to have to change the way we behave. So yes, this is the thing that I need to be moving people over to, and I kind of want your ideas on how we do this. Is this something that's saleable? We've spent so long commoditizing high availability power and commoditizing and making all of society work around the assumption of high availability power. Can we go back to that world of urgency and importance are not the same thing? So yeah, now I've kind of got to the end of the bit I want to talk about. So does anybody have any thoughts, questions, ideas, suggestions?
I have a question that is a selfish question. But surely, and with that presentation about power, electricity, and also ethical concerns that go along with that, but how do you feel about Bitcoin?
Oh God, Bitcoin's awful. I mean, Bitcoin is just awful. It's like the last hurrah of a world in which which everybody just assumed that power was free. You know, I just do think it's the last hurrah. So it kind of reminds me of the witch trials in the 1640s in the UK. There was a famous spate of witch trials of somebody called the Witchfinder General, Matthew Hopkins, who didn't live very far from where I live. And suddenly there was a massive, oh my goodness me, let's burn all the witches right now. But it was at the end of all it was at the end. Mostly people didn't really believe in witches that Hopkins was operating at the same time that Isaac Newton was 3 years old. We were at the beginning of the Enlightenment. It felt like the witch trials were the last hurrah of stupid thinking. And it was the end. After that, everybody just went, oh, for God's sake, we're never going to do this again. This guy everyone should just be locked up and stop being such idiots. And I feel that Bitcoin is being that last hurrah of people who haven't accepted that the world has changed. That's yeah, there we go. The modern equivalent of burning witches at the stake.
Yeah, it is interesting for me because it's the intersection, right, of power like electricity and power like the other kind of power, right? Because that's like it assumes your power is derived from it, like extracting as much as you can from your fellow man and from the environment. So yeah, I also hate Bitcoin.
The interesting thing about Bitcoin is that it isn't necessarily urgent. When you mine Bitcoin, you could mine your Bitcoin when the power is, in 10 years' time, when there'll be time when power is basically free, you could mine your Bitcoin then. And then it kind of thinks, well, then it's not really, how is that proof of work anymore? Because it depends what time you mined it. And so you're not really proof of work because it just depends what time you mined it, which is just a reminder that Bitcoin is a religion and not an actual economic model. Because the underlying proof of work thing, it just makes no sense. In the quite near future, will not make no sense whatsoever.
Caitlin, you want to weigh in on that at all?
You can clearly see my smirk, Kat. And I feel so if you are on this call and you have bought some Bitcoin and you really believe in it, please weigh in, because I'd be really interested to hear a legitimate case for either Bitcoin or in fact blockchain that genuinely cannot be achieved with existing systems that we already have. So here's an example where you're thinking about the teleological versus or in fact the industrialized versus the novel case. And I'm like, actually, if I need a database of things and that it's really secure and I understand how the transactions have happened, we have that. And secondly, and do you mind going on mute? I'm getting a little bit of an echo. Thanks. And in fact, I was on, again, I was at this other finance conference earlier today, and there was somebody pointing out, hey, if you have a transaction that you accidentally sent too much money to someone, and there are real economic cases of this happening in Bitcoin, in the existing banking system, it's hard to get that back, but it's not impossible. You can usually prove that it went wrong. In a Bitcoin scenario, you actually can't get that back. And if you send it, you just have to beg them to send it back to you, basically, is the only case that you have. And it's like, well, that's the opposite of what I wanted in a trust-based system. So yes, I have many thoughts, including the climate ones, and also other generally thoughts around this, which is why I'm now smirking. So
in many ways, I hate NFTs even more than
yes, I would agree with you that is, I mean, you can get into a whole question about economic bubbles, Ponzi schemes, various other things where you kind of look at history and say, hey, do you remember when we all had that thing about tulips and then the Dutch economy collapsed? Maybe let's look at that and then see how that applies to now. So
yeah, thing is, I quite like tulips. I feel there's might have been some value there.
I think everyone likes tulips, and we just don't want to pay like a bajillion dollars for them. And I feel the same way about gifts that I could save myself without paying any money.
Poppy, do you want to weigh in on Bitcoin and or tulips?
I like tulips, similar to Anne. I think they're beautiful. The Bitcoin conversation is probably not one that I'm going to feel too comfortable getting involved in. I like how people like to be creative, and I like how people explore new opportunities to do a variety of new things. And I will never stifle innovation. So whether or not Bitcoin becomes something that actually sticks, I hope that it triggers something else in the future. And for that reason, I can always be an advocate of anything new. Very diplomatic.
I'm going to say
I
will quite gladly stifle innovation if it's harmful to people. And in this case, I think that it is harmful to people. Yeah, certainly for the future of the climate.
Stamp down on innovation.
But I feel like it's really important though to address that point, because so often people think that digital ethics is like just stopping people from innovating, and actually a lot of digital ethics really is about look at the harms that you have in society now, and if you don't make choices about those things, what are you willing to put up with that you are willing not to change? And that can really be an innovation driver. And there are some other ways that it can be a driver as well. So if you think about things like in a broader principle, and actually financially, this is demonstrable. If you have a more diverse team, you will have more innovation in your team. So that has a financial impact on you. And there are many studies that have shown this, particularly one by McKinsey, I think about 10 years ago. And it's really important to think about that, because so often people are accusing digital ethics of being this field that tries to like just stifle innovation. And actually it's like, well, no, what we're saying is we want more perspectives in the room. We want more people to be more involved in the process of creating the things that we all use. And if we have that, we actually will have more innovation.
Yes, there's a book. It's Scott Page, but I think it's Scott Page, but I can't remember the name of the book. I'll look it up and post it in the chat. But about the types of diversity and the impact that they have based on the problem. Whoa, I'm knocking stuff over on my desk. You should see my desk right now. It's just like all coffee and tea, and because I've been up since midnight moderating. But anyway, yes, so different types of diversity are relevant in different problem spaces, and that's really interesting. And of course, I have to use this opportunity to plug the book Epistemic Injustice by Miranda Fricker. For me, that has been one of the most just inspiring and insightful books that I think I've ever read, especially when it comes to innovation, because the whole thing is basically, where does the best kind of innovation come from? It comes from the epistemic margins, right? People who are alienated by the current system, alienated from their own lived experience, right? And so if we can go to folks who are marginalized by the existing system and say, in which ways is this not serving you, right? That's where great transformative innovation can come from. So highly recommend that book, and highly recommend going out and trying to find the people who are underserved. Easier said than done, right? Because it's often very difficult to articulate how you're underserved, or sometimes even to recognize that you're underserved, because it's just a fact of your life. But highly recommend that. And our lovely platform support person has just informed me that we only have 5 minutes left. So I would love to get some key takeaways from each of you, the panelists. I have pages and pages of notes, so I'm not even sure that I'm ready to have one key takeaway, I guess. But Caitlin, if you don't mind, I'll pass it to you first.
Sure. So my key takeaway is, again, you are not alone in being concerned about these issues. There is a large and growing movement of people who really care about digital ethics. There's a large and growing body of tools, both kind of in a design thinking informal way and in a more formalized, here are some procedures that you can adopt, or here are some regulations you might want to be party to kind of a way, or here are some standards that you can adhere to through IEEE and through other standards bodies that will help you think about these issues. And so don't feel like you're alone, or that you don't have any resources, because they're definitely out there for you.
Who wants to go next? Anne?
Oh, go on.
So what would I take away from this? I'm very struck by, I was very struck by a topic section in the middle, talking about giving people stuff and empowering them to make decisions about what data you store, what you do for them, and educate and listen, and don't assume. You know, you just don't know what people are going to need or are going to want. You try it, listen to them, and work with it.
Toppy?
Perfect. Thank you, Anne. And actually, if I was to build on that, I would just say, give yourself the opportunity. Don't, they always say, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And I think that's the same way when I think about approaches to bringing data into new environments. Just start small, learn, and scale. There's nothing wrong with iterating. In fact, you probably go quicker when you start small and you build bigger, rather than spending so much time planning, launch, and it fails, or it doesn't deliver what you thought. So feel confident in the ability to start small and scale.
Wonderful. Great takeaways. Thank you all so much for being here on this panel. As you know, I've been looking forward to it for months, and it totally lived up to my expectations. So I'm just very grateful. I am going to pop over to the lounge area in the square window chat for the next few minutes in between sessions, and hopefully keep the conversation going over there. And if any of you panelists or any of you audience members would like to join, that would be very welcome. I feel like there's still a lot more to say. So thank you all so much. And I think our next session, let me pull it up. The next one is going to be me versus we, and that will be the final like track session of the day before we go to the fireside chat. So I hope to see you all there. Thank you so much, panelists and our wonderful audience. Thank you.
Take care. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the session. Bye now.
Bye.